So, Robbie, what's on your radar?
Well, throughout the pandemic, no one languished under more frustrating restrictions than our nation's children, even though it was well established, even early on, that COVID-19 largely harmed the elderly and spared most healthy young people. U.S. governments, at the behest of federal health officials, forced schools to close anyway. In many parts of the country, class instruction was virtual for an entire year. And when kids were allowed to return to school finally, many of them, they had to continue wearing masks. Now, there's very little evidence that school mask mandates had an impact on COVID-19 case counts. Indeed, experts now concede that only the highest quality masks are doing very much at all to keep the spread down. One clear effect of the masks is that for some people, it's much harder to understand what other people are saying. This was certainly true in schools. National Teachers Union boss Randi Weingarten knows it in her heart because she removed her mask during a meeting in order to be better understood by the people around her. But publicly, she advocated keeping schools closed for as long as possible and for keeping kids masked for as long as possible. Indeed, if it were up to her, students would still face restrictions until the country reached COVID-0, which, by the way, is never going to happen. Weingarten is a key ally of President Joe Biden. The president defers to her on all sorts of education issues. When Biden picked Miguel Cardona to be his education secretary, Jill Biden, explicitly noted that this was done with approval from Randi Weingarten and Becky Pringle, who is also a teachers union leader. Watch.
Secretary Cardona, as you know, my husband made a promise to educators across America that his Secretary of Education would be a leader who taught in a public school classroom. And he found that in you. Right, Randi? Right, Becky? Was our promise.
All right, so that's all background for the subject of today's radar. Yesterday afternoon, Joe Biden tweeted this. Due to the pandemic, kids are behind in math and reading. We know how to help bridge this gap. I'm calling on schools to use American Rescue Plan funds to expand tutoring, summer learning, and after-school programs, and to provide 250,000 more tutors and mentors for our kids. Now, let's be clear. The pandemic indirectly caused kids to fall behind in reading and math. Kids who catch COVID, well, they get sick. Most of them just a little sick, unless they have underlying health conditions. They don't get worse at math. The reason that pandemic-era kids are lagging in reading and math is because for many of them, virtual education was a wholly inadequate experience. Some learned absolutely nothing from it. Working-class families struggled to make sure their kids logged onto their laptops or kept up with their assignments. Students from more challenging backgrounds couldn't engage with the material through a computer screen. Others were so depressed from no longer seeing their friends or participating in extracurricular activities, they tuned out the academic part of school entirely. And when they did get back into the classroom, masks made learning ever so much harder for many kids, particularly those who have learning disabilities. Keep in mind that in New York City, children under the age of 5 were forced to wear masks in school until June 13th. They've been unmasked for less than a month. That's the level of punitive COVID caution forced on young children by public health officials and government education bureaucrats. So let's not deflect responsibility onto the virus. Kids are falling behind in reading and math because of the policies supported by President Biden, other Democrats, and teachers unions. Now, Biden's solution is to use American Rescue Plan funds to pay for tutoring for kids. To that I say, okay, fine. If we're going to spend that money on something, I suppose that's a legitimate use for it. But let's not pretend that a lack of funding is what's holding back public schools. Contrary to what many progressive Democrats frequently claim, public schools are very well funded. They're better funded each and every year. As Corey DeAngelis, a former colleague of mine at Reason Magazine, has often noted, quote, on average, the United States currently spends over $15,000 per student each year, and inflation-adjusted K-12 education spending per student has increased by 280% since 1960. If you don't believe me or DeAngelis, take it from the Washington Post. In 2019, WAPO ran an op-ed by Robert Pianta, Dean of the School of Education at the University of Virginia. The subhead of the piece was, "The one thing we haven't tried in the past 30 years is sufficiently investing in our schools." Okay. Shortly after publishing the piece, WAPO was forced to add this correction. An earlier version of this piece stated that, adjusting for constant dollars, public funding for schools has decreased since the late 1980s. This is not the case. In fact, funding at the federal, state, and local levels has increased between the 1980s and 2019. So the claim that we've decreased funding for public education over time is so flagrantly wrong, even the Washington Post had to correct it. Separately, it is concerning that the dean of a school of education wasn't familiar with the general trajectory of public education funding, but I digress. Now look, it's important to note that the massive increases in funding have not actually improved student math and reading scores. As this chart from the Cato Institute shows, now, and this was in 2010, today we're spending even more on education, with even less to show for it. Why Biden would expect the American Rescue Plan to do the trick, that's anyone's guess. Now, the alternative to funding schools is not to defund schools or to give up, but to fund students. Think about it. No matter how much money we throw at public school districts, the results are disappointing. So why not just give the money back to the families and let them use it to pay for whatever education option they think is right for their individual kid? Just imagine if every kid received a check for $15,000 each year and could use it to pay for or supplement their education. Doesn't that make more sense than giving the money to the schools and just sort of hoping that this time they figure it out, even though they never have before? On every other issue, progressives understand the liberating power of just giving money directly to the people, rather than forcing them to jump through cumbersome hoops to qualify for financial assistance with housing, food, medical care, etc. Just cut them checks. But when it comes to education, many Democrats, and Joe Biden chief among them, want to keep throwing money at a failing system. Help the children, not the education bureaucracy. Just give the people the money. That's my idea for what to do with the rest of the American Rescue Plan funds, because it just hasn't. So first, I think it's important to establish that, look, COVID was not what made kids worse at math and reading. It was our policy response. That was on us. You might say, and it's perfectly fine to argue that, and people can disagree on how much of what we did was necessary because people were dying. Mm-hmm. I think the restrictions for schools and for young people went on far longer than necessary, given that we knew fairly early on that young people, by and large, do not have very shockingly negative COVID health outcomes, that we were not weighing the trade-offs of having kids at home for a year versus in-school learning. That's one thing. And then the second thing is, I just don't, fine, spend this money however you want, but no matter how much money we spend on the school system, we haven't gotten better results yet. So I would just give it back to the families.
Okay, so
hit me, Alimi. What do you think?
I will concede that virtual schooling does negatively impact children's ability to learn. I think that is undisputed. We know that. But I do think the reality was we're in a pandemic where people were dying. And yes, children and younger people might not be as impacted by COVID directly, but children don't live alone, okay? Children have parents, children have families. There are teachers, there are principals, there are lots of other people that are, in fact, at risk of COVID. And in New York City specifically, I could use as an example, we saw lots of deaths. Principals, all kinds of principals, especially in the Bronx and Brooklyn, in these areas with a lot of Black and brown people, we saw lots of deaths of teachers and principals. So there was a very, very real concern, and that's what people were speaking to. And unfortunately, when you are in a pandemic and you have to figure out how to avoid deaths and do your best, there are going to be some negative impacts of that. And I do think that's what you're seeing in terms of the effects on children learning in their education in terms of the pandemic. So I don't knock Biden. I don't have criticism for Biden saying, okay, let's put more money into tutoring and doing these things and bridging this gap. I don't think it, to me, matters whether or not it's the pandemic or the result of trying to deal with the pandemic. And then in terms of the mask. Listen, I know how you feel about the masks, Robbie. I know you feel about the masks, Robbie.
I really don't like them.
Listen, but I'm going to let the people in this particular situation speak for their own selves. Teachers and students all over this country literally protested to have masks. They wanted the masks. They wanted these policies in schools. They were very, very in favor of that. So I can't call this punitive oppression that people had to wear masks, especially when they themselves wanted them. A lot of them wanted these precautions. They wanted it. And third, I want to say this in terms of New York City. Because you said it's not a matter of a lack of public funding, and we have public funding increase in terms of the schools. New York City, there was $1 billion cut to our public school education system, and we're seeing literally right now they're in the middle of laying off teachers, cutting all kinds of programs and stuff because your boy Eric Adams, who you like that he lifted the mask, he's the one who cut.
I'm not giving Eric Adams any credit whatsoever. He lifted it a month ago. Yeah, he should have lifted it. It should have never existed in the first place.
He lifted it a month ago, and then he cut $1 billion from the New York City public school system.
$1 billion from
he cut $200 million, and the rest that was allocated from federal funding and spending they had left.
So that's extra money they were going to get, and then they decided to do something else.
And that's
not the total money they're getting never goes down. Never goes down.
They lost.
The expected increase is sometimes not as large as they expect it to be.
They've lost $1 billion, but overall, and Eric Adams himself specifically cut over $200 million. So there are in fact cuts to the public education school system, and we are seeing the effects of those cuts in losing teachers and losing programs, in losing all these different arts and enrichment programs. So.
But my major point is why. I'm agree. So let's fund public education, sure. But why does public education have to be administered by the government? The government is bad at a lot of things. The government's bad at policing. You talk about that a lot. Why can't we have education privately administered but paid for by the government?
I think there have been
we'll just give you the money, and imagine if every family got $15,000 a year. You could get that can pay for a really good tuition for a really good school. Different parts of the country goes different distances, but I think they could do really well with that rather than giving it to the school district. The school districts that fail, some, not all of them. Some schools are good, but some of the most struggling districts are perfectly well funded. They haven't figured out the magic secret to actually.
But that
isn't
the case, Robbie. We know that school systems are based on taxpayer dollars and where people live. Yes, people who live, rich people, well-to-do people in their neighborhoods, their public schools are funded better, and they themselves have the money to supplement extensively these schools, and that's why they have a better school system. But actual poor communities, no, they don't. They do not have well-resourced education system, and that's a known thing. Also, additionally, teachers and everybody have pushed back a long time.
We'll give them the money, and then they can go to the rich kids' school district.
Robbie, think about this, right? Think about this world where you're a poor indigent person, which is a significant amount of communities, right? You're a poor person. You aren't given money for housing. You're not given money for healthcare. You're not given money for a significant amount of different things that are plaguing you and your family. Oh, I'm going to give you, you are at a deficit in so many ways. Oh, I'll give you $15,000 for school, but you're a million other different ways that you need money to supplement. How do you think that's actually you have the ability to just, this whole $15,000 that's going to go for the schools, and forget all the ways that I can't afford my housing. These people can't live. They can't resource themselves. Healthcare. There are a million different issues that are going to compound to impact that negatively. I understand the sentiment.
That seems better than sending you to the bad school.
I
think, and then you go to a good school. You still have other problems.
Or we can fund things. We can fund things adequately, and instead of having a system where people who live in rich neighborhoods are benefited with better schools and better resource, we give the same to those to poor communities that we give to others. But I understand your sentiment. I understand the sentiment, Robbie.
I do hate those masks.
I know you hate a mask, Robbie.
All right, Team Rising will join us next. Stick around for that.